Plzeň, the Bory prison, June 21, 1949, 6 o'clock in the morning. In the yard, a gallows stands ready. Down the corridor, a 51-year-old man in a general's uniform is being led. Calm, composed, a cigarette in his hand. A moment earlier, in his cell, he was finishing a letter to his family. There is no bitterness in it, only a bitter regret that justice has vanished, and a clear awareness of what is about to happen. This is no judicial error, this is a political murder. That man is Heliodor Píka, divisional general, a hero of 2 world wars, a soldier who breathed for Czechoslovakia, and in a few minutes, his own state will hang him. This is the story of how the young communist power managed to murder its most faithful soldier, a man who served the Republic from his youth, who negotiated the release of thousands of Czechoslovaks from Soviet camps, and who was among the first to warn what kind of regime was being prepared after the war. And it is also a story of how a man can meet his death with honor, when even the state he served has betrayed him. Heliodor Píka was born on July 3, 1897, in the village of Štětina near Opava, a Silesian village right on the border of 2 nations, where Czech, German, and the local Silesian speech mingled. He came from a modest family. His father, Ignác, was an ordinary man. His mother, Jana, née Valashkova, kept house. Young Heliodor finished the Realschule and wanted to become a teacher. But the First World War came, and his life turned in another direction. He enlisted in the Austro-Hungarian army, but like many young Czechs and Slovaks, at the first opportunity, he joined the Czechoslovak legions, first on the Russian front, then with the French. There he grew from a boy into a soldier. For Czechs and Slovaks, who did not yet have a state of their own, the legions meant everything. They were the bridge on which Czechoslovakia was being born. And Píka crossed that bridge fully. After the founding of the Republic in 1918, he stayed in the army, and his professional career began. He went through military schools, including the prestigious École supérieure de guerre in Paris, and grew into an officer of the General Staff. In the 1930s, he served as a military attaché in Romania and Turkey, where he learned the realities of Central European international politics. He was an educated man, gifted in languages, and a convinced Democrat for whom the army was not an ideology, but service to the state. It is precisely this combination, expertise and democratic conviction, that will one day make him a target. When Hitler dismembered the Republic, Píka did not stay passive. He went into exile, joined the foreign resistance, and during the war held the post that would one day seal his fate. He was the commander of the Czechoslovak military mission in the Soviet Union. From Moscow, he organized the flow of Czechoslovak volunteers into the fighting, and perhaps most importantly, negotiated with Moscow the release of thousands of Czechoslovaks who had ended up in Soviet camps and gulags. Many of them had been deported there after the occupation of Carpathian Ruthenia, or after the Soviet-Polish Agreement of 1939. They were people who, without Píka's efforts, would in all likelihood have perished there. Thanks to him, they could return, enlist in the Czechoslovak army in the USSR, and fight for the liberation of their homeland. One of the tragic ironies of this story is that among those Píka thus saved was a man named Karel Vaš, the very man who a few years later would send him to the gallows. Píka's position in Moscow was, moreover, extraordinarily difficult. As a representative of the democratic exile government of Edvard Benes, he stood right in Stalin's empire. He had to keep correct relations with the Soviets and at the same time defend the interests of his country and of individuals. To live for years in such tension without breaking requires a firm character, and Píka had one. But Píka in Moscow did not only organize, he also observed. He saw at first hand how the Soviet system worked, what the Soviet secret services were, and what intentions Moscow had for post-war Central Europe. And about all of this, he conscientiously informed his superior, the defense minister of the exile government, Sergei Inger. In his dispatches, he warned of the politicization of the army, of the infiltration of communists, and of what was to come. He was convinced that the army of the future Czechoslovakia must remain apolitical and professional, that this was the only insurance for democracy. These were dispatches that would one day become evidence, not against any crime committed, but against Píka himself. After the war, Píka returned to Prague as a respected general. He became the deputy chief of the general staff, that is, one of the highest officers of the restored army. It was a logical recognition of his merits. But the new age had different rules. The army was to be people's, meaning under the control of the party. And Píka resisted this. He insisted that the army must be apolitical and professional, that its task was to defend the state, not to serve political power. In the eyes of the communists, who already controlled the key levers of the state, this made him dangerous. And there was another problem. Píka simply knew too much. He knew what the Soviet secret services looked like from the inside. He knew about Moscow's intentions in Central Europe, and he knew specific people too, including those who had worked for the NKVD in the USSR and were now returning home in the uniforms of Czechoslovak officers. It is in this context that Bedřich Reicin becomes a key figure, chief of the Defense Intelligence, OBZ, the organization that handled military counterintelligence. Reicin was a convinced communist, and even his deputy Karel Vaš later described him as an NKVD agent. And it was the OBZ under Reicin that began to surveil Píka, to bug him, follow his meetings, check his mail, vet the people around him. The goal was to liquidate the old army elite that might stand in the party's way. And Píka stood at the very top of the list. The communist coup of February 1948 removed the last brakes. In May 1948 came the blow that took Píka's freedom. He was in the hospital at the time after an operation with an unhealed wound. It was there that, on May 5, 1948, officers of Reicin's OBZ came for him and arrested him. They drove him with stitches, still fresh, straight to prison. They accused him of espionage for Great Britain and of further treasonable and seditious activity. It was absurd. Píka, as commander of the mission during the war, naturally had contacts with Allied services, including the British, because that was his job and his official task. From normal military cooperation, approved by the government in exile, treason was suddenly retroactively manufactured. The investigation was entrusted to Karel Vaš, the same man Píka had once helped out of the gulag in Moscow. According to testimonies that later came to light, Vaš was said to have been brutally pragmatic in this case. He reportedly said himself that they only needed to tell him how many years they wanted delivered on Píka, 15 or the gallows outright, and the indictment would be manufactured accordingly. Whether he said it in those exact words or not, the result looked exactly like that. It was, incidentally, Reicin's decision in a break with normal practice to make Vaš the second prosecutor at the trial itself, an unusual step that shows how much this was a prearranged matter. Píka, meanwhile, was subjected to a long and cruel investigation. The army had its own facility for arrested officers, the infamous Domeček in Prague's Hradčany district, where long-term torture was routinely used against prisoners, methods that in their brutality not infrequently approached medieval practices. They beat, broke, starved, and deprived of sleep. The aim was to break the spirit and force a confession, anything that could be used by the prosecution. Of what Píka went through, few direct testimonies have survived, but what is known is enough. And what matters is that Píka did not break. Even after months of pressure, he did not admit a guilt he did not feel. The trial itself lasted only 3 days, from January 26th to 28th, 1949, and was held in secret before the military senate of the state court in Prague. It was not a hearing but theater with a pre-written ending. The public was not allowed to know about it. Not even Píka's family was fully informed. On January 28, 1949, the verdict fell. Death by hanging. The plea for clemency was then given no chance. Píka's fate had long been decided, in another office by other people and for other reasons than those the indictment admitted. The last day of his life is, even after decades, perhaps the strongest chapter of the whole story, precisely because there is so much dignity in it. On the evening of June 20th, 1949, the telephone rang in the Píka family's Prague flat. The Bory prison called to announce that the general would be hanged the next morning at dawn, at 6 o'clock. His son Milan, then 28, himself already an experienced soldier who had flown in the British Royal Air Force during the war, managed to reach his father in his cell. He spent his entire last night with him. What the two of them said to each other that night, we will never know. We know only one thing: the son wept, the father was calm. It was beside him that Píka finished the letter to his family, a text that has become one of the strongest testimonies of Czechoslovak history. To stand before death without self-pity, without hatred, with a clear conscience, only few can do. Heliodor Píka did. "There is no bitterness in me," he wrote, "only a bitter regret that justice has vanished, and perhaps only temporarily. Vengefulness and hatred are spreading." In other passages, he assured his loved ones that he stood before the end with a clear conscience and the awareness that, despite many mistakes, he had done his duty. And in another letter, he uttered the sentence by which his case would be cited in every textbook one day. This is no judicial error, it is a political murder. To see it so clearly, on the night before one's own death, only a man who has kept both his reason and his conscience can do. At the execution itself, he was calm. He smoked his last cigarette. He had no one to speak to, for around him there were only guards. A former Bory guard later recalled that the general behaved with extraordinary dignity, without panic, without pleading. At 6:10 on the morning of June 21, 1949, he was hanged in the yard of the Plzeň Bory prison. He was 51 years old. It was the first great judicial murder of the communist regime, and by denying him even a soldier's death by firing squad, as would have befitted a general, the regime added a mark of cruelty. After his death, his body was handled anonymously. The family for a long time did not even know where he was buried. After the execution, Píka's name disappeared from official documents, but it did not disappear from the minds of those who knew him. and above all from the mind of his son Milan. Milan Píka spent the rest of his life fighting to clear his father's name. It was a long, exhausting struggle against a regime that had not the slightest desire to admit what it had done. He was helped by a family friend, the Dr. Vahala. For years they gathered evidence, sought witnesses, filed petitions, ran into walls. Only in December 1968, during the brief respite of the Prague Spring, did a miracle occur. The higher military court in Příbram quashed the original verdict in full. The witness testimonies of that day, the radio reported then, confirmed Píka's honest conduct and refuted any sabotage. Evidence of physical coercion against those interrogated in 1949 also emerged. It was a liberation, but a short-lived one. With the arrival of normalization after 1969, the brakes came on again. Píka could once more be spoken of only cautiously, or not at all. Full, definitive rehabilitation and public recognition of his merits came only after November 1989. After the fall of communism came the honors he had deserved long before. President Václav Havel posthumously promoted Heliodor Píka to the highest rank. In Plzeň and in his native Štětina, memorials were unveiled to him. His name is borne today by a regiment of the Army of the Czech Republic and by several streets and squares. And in 2001, Karel Vaš, the prosecutor from the 1949 trial, finally stood before a court. He never admitted guilt and insisted to the end that Píka deserved his punishment. He died in 2012 at the age of 98, unpunished for what he had done. And Bedřich Reicin, the architect of the Píka case himself, ended on the gallows in December 1952 in the Slansky trial, tried for fabricated crimes instead of his real ones. The machine he had helped to build ground him up in the end, too. Of all three figures, then, fate paid only one, the one who was innocent. Heliodor Píka was not a mistake. He was not a misunderstanding that with time could be called a tragic error. He was a target, a deliberate target of a regime that knew that a man like Píka, educated, brave, and devoted to democratic principles, would one day stand in its way. So it preventively removed him. The state murdered its most faithful soldier. His case is exceptional in another way, too. Many victims of the regime did not even live to leave words behind them. Píka left a letter, a text in which a man, face to face with death, refuses hatred and gives the world a lesson in how to die with honor. In a time when everything around him took and lied, he spoke the truth. This is no judicial error, it is a political murder, and that still stands today. Perhaps that is why we remember Píka. Not as a tragic victim to be pitied, but as a soldier who defeated his murderers by dying with more dignity than they lived. His name lives on in the army and in memory. The names of Vas and Reicin in the textbooks of shame. If this story moved you, follow the channel. I bring more faces and fates from the years when both history and human lives were being rewritten in Czechoslovakia. In the coming episodes, we will look at the two men who sent Píka to his death. Tell me in the comments what you think of his case. Thank you for watching to the end.